Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations of Sand. Russell Crane stood at the edge of the property he'd built with his own hands, watching the sunset paint the lake with amber light. At 42, he had achieved what most would consider the American dream. The lakeside estate outside Portland represented 15 years of calculated risks and relentless work. Russell hadn't been born into wealth. The son of a carpenter and a nurse, he'd grown up in a modest neighborhood in western Michigan, where he'd learned two crucial lessons. Nothing comes without sacrifice, and trust must be earned through blood and sweat. He put himself through college working construction, built a small contracting business, then methodically expanded into real estate development. Now he owned Crane Properties, a boutique firm specializing in luxury waterfront developments. His phone rang. It was Howard Blackwell, his attorney, and the closest thing Russell had to a friend. "The Harborview project just got final approval," Howard said. "You're going to make a fortune." "Good. I'll be in tomorrow to review the contracts," Russell replied. As he ended the call, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Valerie was home. His wife of 16 years had become increasingly distant over the past year, but Russell had attributed it to the stresses of her interior design business and their son's teenage rebellion. Tyler, now 15, had transformed from a respectful, athletic boy into a sullen stranger who seemed to resent everything Russell represented. Russell watched as Valerie stepped out of her BMW, her wheat blonde hair caught in the breeze. Even after all these years, she was striking, tall and elegant with a dancer's posture. He'd met her when she was designing the model home for his first major development. She'd been 24, ambitious, with an eye for luxury that matched his own vision. Russell had pursued her with the same methodical determination he applied to business deals. "You're home early," Valerie commented, surprise evident in her voice as she approached. The Harborview approvals came through. He studied her face, noting how she avoided his gaze. "Thought we might celebrate tonight." "Oh." She adjusted the strap of her purse. "I actually made plans with Diane. Design consultation for her summer home." Russell nodded, watching her carefully. "How about tomorrow night? I can make reservations at Raven and Rose." "Sure." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds nice." As they walked toward the house, Russell noticed her phone light up with a text. She quickly turned it over. Inside, Tyler sat at the kitchen island, earbuds in, focused on his laptop. "Hey, son," Russell said. Tyler barely grunted in acknowledgement. Russell had tried everything to connect with his son over the past year. Fishing trips, tickets to Trail Blazers games, even offering to teach him about real estate. Tyler had rejected every overture, preferring the company of his mother and his new friends, particularly Colton Mercer, the son of Dean Mercer, Valerie's business partner. That evening, Russell sat alone in his study, ostensibly reviewing project documents, but actually examining the growing distance in his family. Something wasn't right. The foundation he'd built his life upon was shifting under his feet. Russell Crane didn't achieve success by ignoring warning signs. He opened his desk drawer and removed a small notebook where he'd been documenting patterns: Valerie's late nights, unexplained expenses, hushed phone calls. It was time to verify his suspicions. Russell didn't believe in blind trust, not even with family. Especially not with family. Chapter 2. Veils Lifted. Russell didn't consider himself a suspicious man by nature, merely pragmatic. When something wasn't adding up, he investigated. This methodical approach had saved him from numerous bad business deals. Now, he applied the same technique to his marriage. Early Monday morning, he contacted Lawrence Schultz, a private investigator he'd previously hired for business background checks. Russell laid out his concerns clinically, without emotion. "I need surveillance on my wife. Complete digital and physical monitoring. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she speaks with. Particular attention to Dean Mercer." "Your wife's business partner?" Lawrence asked, gray eyebrows raised slightly. "That's right. They opened that design studio 3 years ago." Russell's jaw tightened. "I've noticed certain inconsistencies. I want proof, one way or another." While waiting for Lawrence's findings, Russell maintained his normal routine. He attended meetings, closed deals, and continued his solitary evening workouts in the home gym. Valerie was increasingly absent, citing client consultations and industry events. For days later, Lawrence called. "We need to meet. Not your office. Not your home." They convened at a secluded table in a private club downtown where Russell held membership. Lawrence placed a manila envelope on the table. "It's what you suspected," he said quietly. "Your wife and Mercer have been involved for at least 8 months, based on the evidence we found." Russell didn't flinch as Lawrence outlined the details. Hotel meetings disguised as client consultations, intimate dinners in neighboring towns, explicit text messages. The digital trail was comprehensive. Russell had expected this, but something else caught his attention. "There's more," Lawrence continued, hesitation evident in his voice. "They've been diverting funds from your joint accounts. Small amounts, but it adds up. They've opened a separate account under a shell company. And they've been talking to Tyler." Russell's eyes narrowed. "My son." Lawrence nodded gravely. "Phone records show frequent calls between Tyler and both Valerie and Mercer. We intercepted several messages. They've been turning him against you, Russell." Methodically, Russell opened the envelope and examined the photographs, bank statements, and transcripts of conversations. One message from Valerie to Dean stood out. "Once her is out of the picture, everything falls into place. T is on board now." After Lawrence departed, Russell remained at the table, sipping bourbon as he processed this information. The betrayal was more calculated than he'd imagined. Not just an affair, but a conspiracy involving his own son. They'd been systematically dismantling everything he'd built. That night, Russell returned home later than usual. Tyler was in his room, and Valerie was reading in bed. She barely looked up when he entered. "How was your day?" he asked casually. "Fine. Just the usual client meetings." She turned a page in her book. "And Dean, how's the business partnership going?" If she noticed the slight emphasis on partnership, she didn't show it. "Good. We're bidding on the Lakewood Heights project." Russell nodded, changing into his night clothes. I was thinking we should take a family vacation. The 3 of us. Maybe to that island resort in the Bahamas you always wanted to visit." Valerie finally looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. "Really? You've always been too busy for extended vacations." "I think it's time to prioritize family," he replied, watching her face carefully. "Life's too short for regrets." She smiled, a genuine smile for once. "I'd like that. I'll talk to Tyler tomorrow." Russell smiled back, already calculating his next move. The chess pieces were in position. Now he needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal before executing his response. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. For 2 weeks, Russell maintained a facade of normalcy while methodically gathering evidence and formulating his strategy. The family vacation idea had worked perfectly. Valerie and Dean were accelerating their plans, believing Russell was oblivious to their betrayal. Lawrence's surveillance team had documented everything. Valerie and Dean meeting with Russell's competitors, discussing proprietary information about Crane Properties' upcoming projects. Tyler accompanying them to view apartments in Seattle, far from Portland and Russell's influence. Substantial transfers from joint accounts to their hidden fund. Most disturbing was a recorded conversation between Dean and Tyler at Dean's lake house. "Once your dad's out of the picture, I'll be there for you and your mom. We'll be a real family, the kind you deserve." Russell's son had replied, "I know. Mom says he never really loved us anyway. Just saw us as possessions." Each revelation should have wounded Russell, but instead, they reinforced his resolve. He'd grown up with nothing, fought for everything he had. He wouldn't allow their betrayal to destroy what he'd built. On a Friday evening, Russell informed Valerie he'd be working late. Instead, he sat in his car near Dean Mercer's condominium, watching as Valerie's BMW pulled into the parking garage. An hour later, Tyler arrived by Uber. A family meeting without the family patriarch. Russell drove home and accessed the safe hidden in his wine cellar. Inside were insurance policies, property deeds, and a flash drive containing contingency plans for every aspect of his life. Russell had never believed in leaving things to chance. At precisely 9 p.m., he called Howard Blackwell. "It's happening. Russell said simply. Activate Protocol 3. Howard, who had helped Russell structure his assets years ago as a precaution against business disputes, understood immediately. All of it. All of it. Transfer everything to the Granite Holdings structure. Effective immediately. Consider done. The alternate banking arrangements are already in place. Anything else? Russell paused, looking at the framed family photo on his desk. A smiling trio on a ski vacation 3 years earlier. Have security ready at all properties by tomorrow morning. Change all access codes. And Howard, thank you. The next day, Russell spent the morning finalizing preparations at his office downtown. When he arrived home in the afternoon, both Valerie's and Tyler's vehicles were in the driveway. Perfect timing. As Russell entered the house, Valerie was descending the stairs, looking startled to see him. Tyler stood in the living room doorway, his expression a mixture of defiance and apprehension. Russell, I didn't expect you home so early, Valerie said, a forced smile on her face. I imagine not, Russell replied calmly. Is there something you want to tell me, Valerie? Perhaps about your plans with Dean? Or the apartment in Seattle? The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're. Stop lying, Russell interrupted, his voice steel-edged but controlled. I know everything. The affair, the diverted funds, turning my own son against me. Tyler stepped forward. She didn't turn me against you. You did that yourself, always choosing work over family. Russell regarded his son coldly. Is that what they told you? That I never cared? While they planned to steal what I've spent my life building. Valerie's demeanor suddenly changed. Her shoulders straightened and her eyes hardened. It doesn't matter now. We're done pretending. Russell. She walked to the door and opened it. Standing outside was Dean Mercer, who entered with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Russell, Dean acknowledged with a nod. This isn't how we wanted things to go. My wife stopped me at the door. Her face was cold as she said, I don't have a husband. You're not the father of your kid. Please leave. Russell recited the words without emotion. Behind her, my son stood smiling, already wearing the keys to my room on his keychain. Valerie's eyes widened with shock at his specific knowledge of their conversation from the previous night. I didn't argue, Russell continued. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and called the bank. The confused expressions on their faces turned to alarm as Russell removed his cell phone and made a call. Now, he said simply, then ended the call. Almost immediately, their phones began buzzing with alerts. Valerie frantically checked hers, her face paling. What did you do? She whispered. Now they're the ones begging. Russell finished, pocketing his phone. You wanted me gone? Wish granted. But you should have been more careful about what you wished for. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. The morning after the confrontation, Russell sat in Howard Blackwell's office, calmly sipping coffee as his attorney updated him on the implementation of Protocol 3. All assets have been transferred to Granite Holdings, Howard confirmed. The timing was impeccable. When Valerie tried accessing the accounts this morning, everything was already secured. Russell nodded, satisfied. And the properties? All locks changed, security codes updated. The lake house, the condo in Aspen, the house in Palm Springs, everything's locked down. Valerie's cards have been canceled. As we speak, she and Tyler are effectively homeless. Russell had prepared for this scenario years ago, long before he had any reason to suspect betrayal. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. Granite Holdings was a complex legal structure, based partially offshore, designed to be impenetrable to litigation. Within it resided the true ownership of all Russell's major assets. On paper, Russell Crane now had almost nothing. In reality, he controlled everything through proxies and trusts. What about Mercer? Russell asked. Howard grimaced. He's already contacted his attorney. They're threatening litigation. Let them try. Russell set down his cup. I need a place to stay temporarily. Is the downtown loft ready? Fully furnished and stocked. The car service can take you there now. As Russell stood to leave, Howard hesitated. Russell, about Tyler, he's still your son. Something cold flickered in Russell's eyes. Is he? He made his choice. To understand Russell's ruthlessness, one had to understand his past. Growing up in Michigan, Russell had learned harsh lessons about loyalty. His father, Abraham Crane, had built a modest construction company through decades of hard work, only to see it destroyed when his business partner and supposed best friend embezzled funds and vanished. The betrayal broke Abraham, who died of a heart attack 6 months later. 16-year-old Russell had watched his mother work double nursing shifts to keep their home. He'd sworn then that he would never be vulnerable like his father. He would never trust blindly, and he would never forgive betrayal. These formative experiences hardened Russell's approach to business and relationships. Every agreement included contingencies for worst-case scenarios. Every partnership was structured to protect his interests absolutely. Even his marriage had been governed by an ironclad prenuptial agreement that Valerie, young and in love, had signed without careful scrutiny. Now, as Russell settled into the sleek downtown loft that served as his contingency residence, he reviewed what he knew about his adversaries. Dean Mercer had his own history. The son of a wealthy family, he'd coasted through life on charm and connections. His design work was mediocre at best, but his social connections had made him valuable to Valerie's business. What Dean really wanted wasn't Valerie. It was access to Russell's wealth and status. Valerie herself had grown up in modest circumstances in California. She'd been ambitious when Russell met her, hungry for success and the finer things. For years, she'd been a true partner, her design talents complementing his development vision. But somewhere along the way, she'd grown resentful of Russell's drive and the sacrifices it required. And Tyler, Russell's jaw tightened thinking about his son. The boy had been corrupted by Valerie's resentment and Dean's false promises. Fed lies about his father while being groomed to help steal his legacy. That evening, Russell received the expected call from Valerie. "What have you done?" Her voice trembled with rage. "The cards don't work. The accounts are empty. We tried going to the Aspen house, and the codes have been changed. Did you really think I wouldn't protect myself?" Russell replied calmly. "Everything you're experiencing now is the direct result of your choices, Valerie. You can't do this. Half of everything is legally mine. Is it? Check the prenuptial agreement you signed. Section 12, paragraph 4. In case of infidelity, you forfeit all claims. The joint accounts contain my business earnings that you were merely authorized to access. As for the properties, they're owned by entities you have no legal claim to." "We'll fight this," she hissed. "Dean's already talking to lawyers. By all means, waste what little money you have left on legal fees. The structures I've created would take years and millions to untangle. Do you really think Dean will stick around once he realizes there's no payday coming?" The line went silent for a moment. "What about Tyler?" she finally asked, her voice smaller. "He's your son. The son who conspired with you and your lover to take everything from me? He made his choice. Now he can live with it." Russell ended the call and turned to his laptop, opening a document titled Contingency Response, Phase 2. This wasn't merely about protection anymore. It was about consequences. Chapter 5, Dominoes of Destruction. 3 days after the confrontation, Russell sat at a corner table in an upscale restaurant with Alexis Bender, the ambitious young owner of a rival design firm to Valerie and Dean's business. "I'm confused, Russell," Alexis said, studying him over her wine glass. "You want me to specifically hire away Valerie and Dean's top designers and key clients? Isn't Valerie your wife?" Russell's expression remained impassive. "My soon-to-be ex-wife. This is strictly business, Alexis. Their firm is vulnerable. I'm offering financial backing for you to expand rapidly and absorb their market share. And in return, 20% silent partnership and first right of refusal on design work for all Crane Properties developments." Alexis smiled slowly. "You're not just trying to grow my business. You're systematically destroying theirs." Russell didn't deny it. "Do we have a deal?" Within 2 weeks, Valerie and Dean's design studio was hemorrhaging both talent and clients. Their 3 senior designers resigned simultaneously, taking major clients with them to Alexis Bender's rapidly expanding firm. Their landlord suddenly terminated their lease due to a previously unenforced clause, the building having been recently acquired by a subsidiary of Granite Holdings. Meanwhile, Russell had Howard Blackwell file for divorce on grounds of adultery, complete with comprehensive evidence packages. The filing made headlines in local business publications, further damaging Valerie and Dean's professional reputations. Valerie and Tyler had moved into Dean's condominium, but the situation was growing increasingly tense. Financial pressure was mounting. Dean's savings were depleting rapidly as he funded both living expenses and escalating legal fees in their futile battle against Russell's financial fortress. Russell monitored these developments through Lawrence's continued surveillance. He took no joy in their suffering. This wasn't about emotion. It was about justice and consequences. One evening, Russell received an unexpected visitor at his downtown loft. The security desk called up to announce that Tyler was in the lobby. Russell considered turning him away, but decided a confrontation might be informative. Send him up. When Tyler entered, Russell was struck by how much older his son looked after just 3 weeks. The boy's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "Nice place," Tyler commented, looking around the minimalist loft. "Already moved on from us, huh? What do you want, Tyler?" Russell remained seated at his desk. "Mom's a mess. Dean's talking about moving to Seattle. Says there's nothing left for them here." Tyler paced nervously. "This has gone far enough, don't you think?" Russell studied his son carefully. "Far enough? You conspired with them. You were ready to take everything I built and walk away without a second thought." "That's not how it was," Tyler protested. "Dean said you'd be fine, that you had plenty of money hidden away. So theft is acceptable as long as the victim can afford the loss." Russell's voice remained level. "Tell me something, Tyler. Those conversations where you said, 'I never loved you,' that I only saw you as a possession. Did you actually believe that?" Tyler looked away. "Mom said, 'Your mother lied. Everything I built was meant for you someday. I worked 16-hour days so you'd have opportunities one never had. I missed games and school events not because I didn't care, but because I was securing your future." For a moment, Russell saw doubt flicker across his son's face. "It doesn't matter now," Tyler finally said. "We need help. Real help. Mom's talking about moving in with her sister in California. We can't keep living with Dean. They're fighting all the time about money. And so the real reason for your visit emerges," Russell said coldly. "You're not here to reconnect. You're here because the people who convinced you to betray me are now failing to provide what they promised. Dad, please. You made your choice, Tyler. Now you get to experience the consequences of blind trust. It's actually a valuable lesson, one I had to learn myself at about your age." Tyler's face hardened. "You're a heartless bastard. No wonder Mom wanted out." As his son turned to leave, Russell called after him. "When Dean abandons you both, and he will, remember who taught you that family means nothing when it becomes inconvenient." After Tyler left, Russell didn't immediately return to work. Instead, he stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. This wasn't how he'd imagined his family story would unfold. But weakness now would only validate their betrayal. Phase 2 was proceeding as planned, but the most decisive move was yet to come. Chapter 6: The Cold Edge of Winter. By early December, 6 weeks after the initial confrontation, the situation had developed exactly as Russell had predicted. Dean Mercer, facing financial ruin and frustrated by failed legal attempts to access Russell's assets, had broken things off with Valerie. Their design studio had closed, unable to meet operating costs after losing key clients and staff. Valerie and Tyler had moved in with her sister in Sacramento, reduced to borrowing money for basics. Tyler had enrolled in a local high school, forced to leave behind his friends and activities in Portland. Russell, meanwhile, had completely restructured his business operations. Crane Properties was thriving, with the Harborview development becoming the company's most successful project to date. Publicly, Russell presented a stoic image of a man focused on his work despite personal difficulties. Privately, he monitored his estranged family's deteriorating circumstances through Lawrence's occasional updates. Russell took no pleasure in their downfall, but he recognized it as the natural consequence of their actions. Actions had consequences. This was the fundamental principle by which he lived. On a snowy December evening, Russell was working late at his office when his private line rang. He didn't recognize the number. "Russell Crane." "It's me." Valerie's voice sounded strained, smaller than he remembered. Russell said nothing, waiting. "I need to talk to you," she continued. "About Tyler. He's not doing well." Define not doing well. He's depressed, barely eating, failing his classes. She paused. He needs his father. He needed a father when he was conspiring with you and Dean. Now he needs a financial provider. Russell's voice remained even. Those are different functions. For God's sake, Russell, he's 15. He made a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or failing a test. What Tyler did was a calculated betrayal based on months of deception. Russell checked his watch. "I have a meeting to prepare for, Valerie. Was there something specific you wanted?" Her breathing grew ragged on the line. "We can't live like this. My sister wants us out after the holidays. I can't find work. Tyler needs stability. And Dean? Has your lover abandoned his promises so quickly?" "Dean's in Seattle. He said he needs to focus on rebuilding his career." The bitterness in her voice confirmed what Russell had known would happen. "So predictable," Russell murmured. "Please, Russell. Not for me, but for Tyler. I'll have Howard contact you next week with a proposal for Tyler's support, conditional on several factors." Russell's tone was businesslike. "As for you, Valerie, I recommend accepting the divorce settlement offer already presented. It's more than fair given the circumstances, and fighting it will only drain what resources you have left." After ending the call, Russell gazed out at the snow falling on downtown Portland. The city looked peaceful, cleansed by the white blanket covering its surfaces. Soon, this chapter would be closed permanently. The following morning, Russell met with Howard to outline the terms for Tyler's support: a modest monthly allowance, tuition for a boarding school in Massachusetts, and a path to college funding, all contingent on Tyler meeting academic standards and having no contact with Dean Mercer. "This seems unusually generous given your position on Tyler's betrayal," Howard observed. "It's not generosity," Russell replied. "It's strategic. Tyler needs to understand that actions have consequences, but also that different choices lead to different outcomes. This gives him a path forward, but one that requires effort and discipline on his part." Howard nodded slowly. "And Valerie? The original offer stands. She gets enough to restart somewhere modest, nothing more. The prenuptial is ironclad." As Howard gathered his documents, he hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Dean Mercer has been making inquiries about Harborview, approaching investors, suggesting there might be structural issues based on inside information." Russell's expression darkened. "Is that so? It seems Mr. Mercer hasn't learned his lesson about consequences." That afternoon, Russell drove to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Portland. Lorenzo Maddox, a former military intelligence officer who occasionally handled sensitive problems for Russell, was waiting in a sparse conference room. "Dean Mercer," Russell said without preamble, sliding a folder across the table. "He's attempting to damage my business by spreading false information to investors." Lorenzo reviewed the contents silently. "What are you looking for exactly?" "Everything. Financial history, personal weaknesses, pressure points. He's chosen to escalate this conflict. I want him neutralized." Russell's eyes were cold. "Not physically harmed, but removed as a threat permanently." "Understood." Lorenzo closed the folder. "Everyone has secrets, Russell. I'll find his." As December progressed, Russell implemented the support arrangement for Tyler through Howard. Valerie reluctantly accepted the divorce settlement, recognizing she had no viable alternatives. The legal process was proceeding smoothly toward final dissolution in January. Russell should have felt vindicated. Instead, as he decorated his loft's small Christmas tree alone, he found himself reflecting on holidays past. Tyler's excitement as a child, family ski trips to Aspen, even the quiet moments with Valerie before everything soured. His phone interrupted these uncharacteristic reflections. It was Lorenzo. "You're going to want to see this immediately," Lorenzo said, his voice unusually animated. "I found something about Mercer that changes everything." Chapter 7, Buried Truths. The file Lorenzo delivered contained information that even Russell, with his meticulous planning, hadn't anticipated. Dean Mercer's past held secrets far darker than financial improprieties or routine infidelity. Before moving to Portland 6 years ago, Dean had lived in Phoenix under the name Daniel Merritt. He'd been investigated for the suspicious death of his business partner's wife, a case that was never prosecuted due to lack of evidence, but remained technically open. He'd changed his name and relocated after the scandal damaged his reputation. Most significantly, Lorenzo had uncovered financial transactions suggesting Dean had been systematically embezzling from the design studio he shared with Valerie. Small amounts, cleverly concealed in vendor payments, had been flowing to a private account in Seattle for over 2 years. Russell spent hours studying the evidence. The parallels to his father's story were impossible to ignore. A trusted partner secretly stealing, planning to leave others to face the consequences. History repeating itself across generations. Even more disturbing were text messages between Dean and a woman in Seattle. Messages that proved his relationship with Valerie had been calculated from the beginning as a way to access Russell's wealth. One message from over a year ago read, "V thinks we're in love. It's almost too easy. Once we execute the plan, I'll have everything settled in Seattle for us." Russell had assumed Dean and Valerie were equal partners in betrayal. Now it appeared Valerie herself had been manipulated, a pawn in Dean's larger scheme. This revelation didn't excuse Valerie's infidelity or Tyler's disloyalty, but it cast their actions in a different light. They hadn't just betrayed Russell. They'd been deceived themselves, vulnerable to manipulation because of their resentments and insecurities. For 3 days, Russell considered this new information, weighing different approaches. Finally, he called Lorenzo again. "I need you to arrange a meeting. Neutral location. The upcoming weekend." "With Mercer?" Lorenzo asked. "No, with Valerie. Just Valerie. Don't tell her anything about what we've discovered." The meeting was arranged at a hotel restaurant in Eugene, halfway between Portland and Sacramento. When Valerie arrived, Russell was already seated at a corner table. She looked thinner, her designer clothes replaced by simpler attire, her confident posture diminished. "Thank you for coming," Russell said as she sat down. "Your message said it was important," she replied, her voice guarded. "Something about Tyler's arrangements." Russell studied her for a moment, then slid a folder across the table. "Before we discuss Tyler, you should review this. Take your time." Valerie opened the folder hesitantly. As she read, her expression transformed from confusion to disbelief to devastation. Color drained from her face. "This can't be real," she whispered, looking up at Russell with wide eyes. "Dean wouldn't. Every document is authenticated. Every transaction verified." Russell's voice was dispassionate. "He played you, Valerie. He played us both." Tears formed in her eyes as she continued reading. When she reached the messages to the woman in Seattle, her hands began to shake. "He said he loved me, that we were building a future together." Her voice broke. "He convinced me that you never really cared about us, that you only saw us as possessions. And you believed him because it was easier than addressing the real issues in our marriage." Russell responded evenly. "You were unhappy, and he offered an easy escape." Valerie set down the documents, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Why are you showing me this? To prove how easily I was manipulated? To make me feel even worse about what I've done?" "No, I'm showing you because you deserve to know the truth. And because what happens next depends on what you do with this information." She looked at him questioningly. "Dean Mercer destroyed my family," Russell continued, his voice now carrying an edge of steel. "He manipulated my wife, poisoned my son against me, and tried to steal what I spent my life building. Now he's in Seattle, attempting to damage my business reputation while planning his next scheme." "What are you going to do?" Valerie asked quietly. "I'm going to ensure he never harms another family." Russell leaned forward. "The question is, are you going to help me?" Valerie stared at him, conflict evident in her expression. "Why would you want my help after what I did?" "Because you're the only person who can get close enough to him without raising suspicion. Because you have as much reason to want justice as I do. And because helping me is the only way you'll ever rebuild any kind of relationship with Tyler. You're using our son as leverage? I'm offering you a path to redemption, Valerie. For both of you." Russell's expression softened slightly. Tyler doesn't know about any of this yet. He still believes Dean cared about him. Finding out the truth from someone who loves him will be difficult enough. Valerie was silent for a long moment, staring at the damning evidence before her. Finally, she looked up, something hardening in her gaze. "What do you need me to do?" Russell outlined his plan, methodical, comprehensive, and designed to ensure Dean Mercer would face the consequences of his actions without any risk to those implementing justice. Valerie listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Russell finished, Valerie took a deep breath. "I'll do it. Not for us. There probably isn't an us anymore, but for Tyler. And because Dean deserves whatever's coming to him." As they parted ways, Valerie hesitated. "Russell, I'm sorry. Not just for believing Dean, but for everything before that. We were broken long before he came along." Russell nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting her apology. "Actions have consequences, Valerie. Always. But sometimes, different actions can create different outcomes. Remember that." Chapter 8. The Execution. January brought bitter cold to Seattle, where Dean Mercer was establishing his new life. He'd leased an expensive downtown condo and was courting potential clients, trading on his Portland reputation while carefully avoiding mention of his business's collapse. Dean had no idea he was already under comprehensive surveillance. Lorenzo's team monitored his every move, building a detailed profile of his daily patterns, professional contacts, and digital activities. Russell, reviewing the reports from Portland, waited for the optimal moment to implement the next phase. That moment came when Valerie contacted Dean in mid-January, her voice tearful over the phone. "I can't do this anymore, Dean. Russell's lawyers are crushing me. The settlement barely covers rent for a studio apartment. Tyler's miserable at that boarding school." She paused, allowing desperation to color her tone. "I need your help. Please." Dean hesitated, clearly reluctant to re-entangle himself with Valerie's problems. "Val, I'm just getting established here. I don't have resources to—" "I'm not asking for money," she interrupted. "I have information about Russell's business, his financial structures. Information worth a lot to the right people." This caught Dean's attention. "What kind of information?" "Not over the phone. I need to see you. I can come to Seattle this weekend." After some persuasion, Dean agreed to meet her. Russell, listening to the recorded call, nodded with satisfaction. Valerie had played her part perfectly, appealing to both Dean's greed and his ego. That weekend, Valerie arrived in Seattle, checked into the hotel Russell had arranged, and met Dean for dinner. She was wearing a wire, with Lorenzo's team monitoring from a nearby van. "You look good," Dean said, evaluating her across the table. His initial reluctance had given way to calculated charm. "Appearances can be deceiving," Valerie replied with a bitter smile. "I'm barely holding it together." Throughout dinner, she carefully built a narrative about Russell's supposedly vulnerable financial position, hinting at information she discovered while going through documents before leaving Portland. "He has a backup structure, Grana Holdings. That's where everything valuable is hidden." She leaned closer, including electronic records of every development project for the past 10 years. Plans, permits, material specifications, everything. Dean's eyes gleamed with interest. "And you have access to these records?" "I have the access credentials. Russell never changed them. He doesn't know I found them." She lowered her voice. "There are problems with Harborview, Dean. Serious structural issues they've covered up. The kind of information that could be worth millions to the right parties." "Why are you telling me this?" Dean asked, suspicion finally surfacing. "You could take this to Russell's competitors yourself." Valerie's expression hardened convincingly. "Because I don't just want money. I want Russell to suffer like I'm suffering. You know his connections. You know who would pay most for this information. I can get the files, but I need your help to monetize them." By the end of dinner, Dean was fully engaged, already planning how to approach potential buyers for the non-existent information. They agreed to meet the following afternoon at Dean's condo to review the files Valerie claimed to have downloaded. As she left the restaurant, Valerie spoke quietly into her concealed microphone. "He's in. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Russell received the confirmation in Portland and made one final call to Lorenzo. "Proceed as planned. Everything needs to be in place by noon tomorrow." The next day, Valerie arrived at Dean's luxury condo building carrying a laptop bag. Lorenzo's team had already positioned themselves throughout the building, including a maintenance worker on Dean's floor. Dean welcomed Valerie with a kiss on the cheek, his earlier reluctance completely gone now that he sensed profit. "I've been thinking about potential buyers. I have contacts at Thompson Development who would pay generously for verified structural issues with Harborview." "Let's look at the files first," Valerie suggested, removing a laptop from her bag. "The evidence needs to be rock solid." As Dean leaned over her shoulder, eager to see the damaging information, Valerie opened a folder containing construction photos. While he was distracted, she pressed a specific key combination, activating a program Russell's IT specialist had installed. "What am I looking at here?" Dean asked, squinting at images of foundation work. "Evidence," Valerie replied, standing suddenly. "Just not the kind you were expecting." Dean looked up in confusion as his own television suddenly activated. On the screen appeared images of Dean meeting with various people in Seattle, followed by recordings of phone conversations, including calls to associates in Phoenix discussing his former identity as Daniel Merritt. "What the hell is this?" Dean demanded, face paling. "This is justice, Dean. Or should I say Daniel?" Valerie's voice was steel-edged. "We know everything. Your history in Phoenix. The embezzlement from our design studio. Your real girlfriend in Seattle." Dean lunged for the laptop, but Valerie stepped back quickly. "Don't bother. It's already done. Everything has been transmitted to multiple destinations." The television continued displaying evidence. Financial records showing Dean's systematic theft from the design studio, his communications with his Seattle girlfriend discussing how he was using Valerie, and finally, records from the Phoenix investigation into his business partner's wife's death. "You crazy bitch," Dean snarled, advancing toward Valerie threateningly. "You think Russell put you up to this? After everything?" Before he could reach her, the door opened and Lorenzo entered with another man, a Seattle police detective. "Dean Mercer," the detective asked. "We have some questions about financial improprieties related to Winterstone Design Studio in Portland. We also have colleagues in Phoenix who are very interested in speaking with you regarding the reopened investigation into Patricia Lennox's death." As Dean was escorted from the condominium, Lorenzo ensured Valerie was safely on her way to the airport. The plan had executed flawlessly. By evening, Dean Mercer was in custody, facing charges in 2 states and the complete destruction of his carefully constructed false identity. Russell, receiving confirmation of the operation's success, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Dean had attempted to destroy Russell's family and business using manipulation and lies. Now he would face the consequences of his own buried truths. True justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring natural consequences for one's actions. Dean had sown deception and betrayal. Now he would reap their harvest. Chapter 9. Frost and Thaw. 3 months after Dean Mercer's arrest, Russell stood on the observation deck of Portland's Pittock Mansion, gazing at the city spread below him. Early spring sunshine illuminated Mount Hood in the distance, its snow-capped peak brilliant against the blue sky. Dean remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk. The reopened investigation in Phoenix had uncovered new evidence in the death of Patricia Lennox, and prosecutors were confident in securing a conviction. His financial crimes in Portland had been fully documented, ensuring he would face justice in multiple jurisdictions. The divorce between Russell and Valerie had been finalized 6 weeks earlier. The terms remained as Russell had originally offered, enough for Valerie to start over modestly, but nothing approaching the luxury she had once enjoyed. She had accepted without protest, acknowledging it was more than fair given the circumstances. Russell's phone vibrated with a text message. "We're here." He turned to see Valerie's car, pulling into the parking area below. She emerged first, followed by Tyler, home from boarding school for spring break. This meeting had been Russell's idea. Neutral ground, a casual lunch to discuss Tyler's future. It wasn't forgiveness precisely. Russell Crane still believed absolutely in consequences. But he also recognized that both Valerie and Tyler had been victims of manipulation, even if their own weaknesses had made them vulnerable to it. As they approached, Russell noted the changes in his son. Tyler stood straighter, his expression less sullen than defiant. The expensive Massachusetts boarding school was known for its discipline and academic rigor. According to reports Russell received, Tyler was performing adequately, though not exceptionally. Russell, Valerie acknowledged with a nod. She looked different, her hair shorter, her clothing simpler. She had found work at a small design firm in Sacramento, starting over at a junior level. "Dad," Tyler said, his voice caught between reluctance and something else, perhaps regret. "Thank you both for coming," Russell replied. "Shall we have lunch? The view from the restaurant here is exceptional." During lunch, conversation remained cautious, focused primarily on Tyler's school experiences and his plans for college. Russell listened more than he spoke, evaluating his son's maturity and judgment. As they finished dessert, Russell addressed the underlying tensions directly. "I didn't arrange this meeting to dwell on the past, but we can't move forward without acknowledging it." Tyler looked down at his plate, while Valerie met Russell's gaze steadily. "What happened was a failure on multiple levels," Russell continued. "Dean Mercer was the architect of much of the deception, but he exploited real problems that already existed between us. I should have seen through him," Valerie said quietly. "I wanted to believe someone could love me the way he pretended to." Tyler looked up, his expression pained. "He told me you didn't care about us, that you only cared about your business. I believed him because it felt true. You were always working, always focused on the next project." Russell nodded, accepting this perspective without defensiveness. "I built everything I did with you in mind, Tyler. The legacy was always meant for you. But I failed to make that clear, to balance the present and the future." He turned to Valerie. "And I failed to see how unhappy you'd become. That doesn't excuse your choices, but I recognize my part in creating the conditions Dean exploited." "What happens now?" Tyler asked directly. "That depends on what you both want," Russell replied. "I'm not offering reconciliation in the traditional sense. Too much has happened for that. But I'm offering a path forward." He outlined his proposal. Tyler would complete his education at the boarding school, then attend college with Russell's full financial support. Upon graduation, if Tyler demonstrated responsibility and business acumen, there would be a place for him at Crane Properties. For Valerie, Russell offered professional connections in Sacramento to help rebuild her design career and a commitment to civil co-parenting of Tyler. "This isn't forgiveness," Russell clarified, his eyes hard. "I don't forget betrayal, and I don't pretend it didn't happen. But I recognize degrees of culpability, and I believe in proportional consequences." Tyler looked at his father with new understanding. "You're still punishing us, just less severely than Dean." Russell's expression remained steady. "I'm offering consequences appropriate to actions and circumstances. Dean plotted meticulously to destroy lives for personal gain. Your actions, while damaging, were born partly from manipulation and partly from genuine grievances." "And if we reject your terms?" Valerie asked. "Then we maintain the current arrangements. The choice is yours." Russell's tone made clear this wasn't a negotiation. After lunch, as they walked through the mansion's gardens, Tyler fell into step beside his father, slightly apart from Valerie. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, voice low. "Not just for believing Dean, but for betraying you. For being weak." Russell studied his son's profile, so similar to his own at that age. Weakness isn't permanent unless you allow it to be. The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise afterward. "Is that what you're doing now? Rising after falling?" "No," Russell corrected. "I didn't fall. I was attacked, and I defended what's mine. There's a difference." Tyler nodded slowly. "Will you ever truly trust me again?" Russell didn't soften the truth. Trust is earned, not given. Every action builds or damages it. You've damaged yours significantly. Rebuilding it will take years of consistent choices. But it's possible. It's possible, Russell confirmed. Though it will never be blind trust. That's a luxury I don't grant anyone. As they prepared to part ways, Valerie approached Russell while Tyler waited by the car. "You could have destroyed us completely," she said. "Why didn't you?" Russell looked past her to Tyler, then back to her face. "Because total destruction wasn't proportional to your actions. I believe in justice, Valerie, not vengeance. Is that what you call what happened to Dean? Justice. Absolutely. Everything that's happening to him is the direct result of his own actions finally catching up to him. Russell's expression was implacable. Just as everything happening to you and Tyler now is the consequence of yours. Valerie studied him for a moment. You really don't forgive, do you? Not completely. No, Russell acknowledged without apology. But I can move forward without forgiveness if there's sufficient reason to do so. He gestured toward their son. He's that reason. As Valerie and Tyler drove away, Russell returned to the observation deck, watching the panorama of the city he'd helped build. The cold calculation that had guided him through this ordeal had served its purpose. Justice had been served, proportional to each person's actions. Russell Crane would never again trust blindly, never fully forgive betrayal. But he would move forward, rebuilding what could be salvaged, discarding what couldn't. The foundations of his life had been tested and had held firm. Everything else could be reconstructed, stronger than before. A fortress built on the bedrock of hard-earned wisdom. Behind him, Mount Hood gleamed in the spring sunshine, its peaks still covered in winter's frost, even as the world below awakened to new growth. Like the mountain, Russell would maintain his cold, impenetrable core while allowing measured change around it. This was his nature. This was his strength. This was his justice. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. George Buck had learned long ago that the most dangerous men were often the quietest ones. At 47, he carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who had seen the world's darker corners and emerged intact. His neighbors in suburban Denver knew him as a mild-mannered insurance investigator who coached Little League on weekends and maintained the most pristine lawn on Maple Street. They didn't know about the 15 years he'd spent in Army intelligence or the classified operations that had taught him how to read people like open books. "Dad, you're burning the burgers," Stella Buck called from the patio door, her voice carrying that easy warmth that reminded George why he'd walked away from a Pentagon promotion to be present for moments like these. At 23, Stella possessed her mother's striking features and her father's sharp intelligence. Fresh out of Colorado State with a business degree, she'd landed her first real job at Meridian Financial Solutions, a mid-sized investment firm downtown. George flipped the patties, watching his daughter through the kitchen window as she helped her mother, Eleanor, set the outdoor table. "How was the first day?" Eleanor asked as they settled down for dinner. After 25 years of marriage, she still made George's pulse quicken when she smiled. Her auburn hair caught the evening light, and her green eyes sparkled with genuine interest in their daughter's answer. Stella's expression dimmed slightly. "It was fine. Mr. Schmidt, my supervisor, seems very hands-on with his management style." George's internal radar, finely tuned from years of detecting lies and half-truths, picked up the subtle tension in his daughter's voice. "Hands-on how?" "Oh, lots of feedback, very involved in training." Stella pushed salad around her plate. "He insists on going over everything personally." Eleanor reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "First jobs are always overwhelming, sweetheart. I'm sure you'll find your rhythm." George nodded, but filed away the micro-expressions he'd caught. The slight tightening around Stella's eyes when she mentioned Schmidt, the way she avoided direct eye contact. In his line of work, these tells usually meant someone was hiding something unpleasant. After dinner, as Eleanor loaded the dishwasher, George found Stella on the back porch, staring at her phone with a frown. "Everything all right?" She looked up, startled. "Just work stuff. Mr. Schmidt wants me to review some files tonight for tomorrow's meeting." She held up her phone, showing a text message with a timestamp of 8:47 p.m. "He says it shows initiative." George's jaw tightened imperceptibly. In his experience, Bosses who sent work-related texts at nearly 9 p.m. on an employee's first day were establishing dominance, not assessing initiative. "Stella," he said carefully, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Even if you think it might worry Mom and me." For a moment, her composure wavered, and George saw something vulnerable flash across her features. Then she straightened, giving him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Dad. Really. Just first-day jitters." George had interrogated terrorists who were more convincing. That night, lying in bed beside Eleanor, George stared at the ceiling and replayed the evening's conversation. His wife's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but rest eluded him. 23 years of fatherhood had taught him that Stella's forced brightness meant trouble. 15 years of intelligence work had taught him that predators often started subtle, testing boundaries before escalating. He thought about Craig Schmidt. George made it his business to research people who entered his family's orbit, and Meridian Financial's website had provided basic information. Schmidt was 38, had been with the company for 6 years, and managed the junior analyst program. His LinkedIn profile showed a career built on aggressive networking and climbing corporate ladders. But profiles only showed what people wanted others to see. George's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Stella. "Can't sleep. Tomorrow feels like a big day. Love you, Dad." The timestamp read 11:23 p.m. George had seen enough late-night anxiety to recognize it. His daughter was scared, and she was trying to handle it alone. He typed back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Remember, you're stronger than you know." As he set the phone aside, George Buck made a decision that would have consequences none of them could foresee. Tomorrow, he would begin his own investigation into Craig Schmidt, because some things were more important than staying in the shadows. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Facade. The second day brought storm clouds, both literal and metaphorical. George sat in his home office, rain pattering against the windows as he compiled an insurance fraud report, when his personal phone rang. Stella's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart, how's day 2 treating you?" Silence stretched long enough to make George's protective instincts flare. Then, in a voice carefully controlled, "Fine. Good. Just calling to check in." "Where are you calling from?" "The bathroom." The admission came out small and embarrassed. "I needed a minute." George closed his laptop. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Not exactly. It's just..." She took a shaky breath. "Mr. Schmidt has very specific ideas about professional appearance. He said my blouse was too conservative, that clients respond better to confidence. He suggested I might want to shop for something more engaging." Heat flashed through George's chest. Did he now? He was just trying to help, Dad. This industry is competitive, and image matters. "I know that." "Stella, listen to me carefully. A supervisor commenting on your clothing, especially suggesting you dress in a way that's more engaging, that's not normal mentoring. You don't understand corporate culture. I understand predatory behavior." The words came out sharper than intended, and George immediately softened his tone. "Sweetheart, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." After a long pause, "I need this job, Dad. The student loans, the rent on my apartment. I can't afford to make waves over misunderstandings." The call ended with Stella promising to be careful, but George heard the defeat in her voice. She was already making excuses, already accepting treatment that made her uncomfortable because she felt trapped by circumstances. George opened his laptop and began typing. His insurance work gave him access to various databases and investigative tools. Craig Schmidt's name yielded interesting results. Born in Phoenix, moved to Denver 8 years ago after what appeared to be an abrupt departure from a Phoenix investment firm. No criminal record, but George's trained eye caught inconsistencies in the timeline. A 6-month gap in employment. References that seemed curiously sparse for someone supposedly climbing the corporate ladder. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Stella called me crying. Said she was just overwhelmed, but something's wrong. Can you pick up dinner? I want to be here when she gets home." George was already reaching for his keys. That evening, Stella arrived home at 7:30 with red-rimmed eyes and a forced smile. She hugged both parents tightly, holding on longer than usual. "Rough day?" Eleanor asked gently. just a steep learning curve. Stella's voice was steady, but George noticed how she avoided mentioning Schmidt directly. Mr. Schmidt says I need to be more receptive to feedback. Apparently, I'm too defensive. Defensive about what? George kept his tone casual while serving the Chinese takeout. Everything. My work, my appearance, my attitude. Stella picked at her lo mein. He says successful women in finance need thick skin and open minds. George and Eleanor exchanged glances. Their daughter was naturally confident, not defensive. If she was being labeled as such, it meant someone was manufacturing conflicts to justify their behavior. Has it given you written feedback? George asked. Performance reviews? Training assessments? No, it's all been verbal. He prefers face-to-face communication. Says it builds stronger working relationships. Another red flag. Verbal feedback left no paper trail, no accountability. After Stella went to her old room for an early night, George and Eleanor sat in the living room, speaking in low voices. She's scared, Eleanor said. I haven't seen her this withdrawn since high school. She's being systematically undermined. Classic psychological manipulation. Criticize their appearance, their competence, their attitude, until they start questioning their own judgment. Eleanor looked at him with the expression she'd worn during his military years when he'd spoken too knowledgeably about dark subjects. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, George said carefully, that I might need to do some research into Mr. Schmidt's management style. George. Her voice carried a warning. Nothing dramatic. Just due diligence. That night, George lay awake planning. In military intelligence, they'd had a saying, information is ammunition. Tomorrow, he would begin loading his weapons. The next morning, Stella left for work with shoulders set in defensive lines. George waited until Eleanor departed for her job at the elementary school, then opened his laptop and began what he euphemistically called background research. Craig Schmidt lived in a high-end apartment complex in Lodo, drove a leased BMW, and maintained social media profiles that projected success and confidence. But George's deeper digging revealed more interesting details. 3 different women had left Meridian Financial during Schmidt's tenure, all within their first 6 months. Exit interviews were confidential, but the pattern was suggestive. George's phone rang. Stella again, calling from what he now assumed was her daily bathroom refuge. Dad! Her voice was barely above a whisper. He scheduled a dinner meeting with me. Tonight. Says it's important for my career development. George's hand tightened on the phone. A dinner meeting. Just the 2 of you. He says senior management often conducts important conversations outside the office. More relaxed environment for honest feedback. Stella, you don't have to go. I do. The desperation leaked through her controlled tone. He made it clear that my probationary review depends on showing commitment. 3 months to prove myself, remember? After she hung up, George sat staring at his phone. The careful, methodical approach he'd planned suddenly felt inadequate. Schmidt was escalating, pushing boundaries, isolating his prey. George Buck had spent 15 years learning how to hunt humans who thought they were untouchable. It was time to dust off those skills. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The restaurant was upscale enough to seem professional, intimate enough to be inappropriate. George sat in his rented sedan across the street, watching through telephoto lenses borrowed from his insurance work as Craig Schmidt led his daughter to a corner table. The reservation, he'd confirmed with a single phone call, was under Schmidt's personal name, not the company account. Through the window, George watched body language tell the story his daughter couldn't. Schmidt leaned in too close, his hand gesturing near Stella's arm without quite touching. Stella's posture was rigid, her smile mechanical. She picked at her food while Schmidt monopolized the conversation, occasionally laughing at his own remarks with theatrical enthusiasm. George's phone buzzed. A text from Stella to her mother. Dinner running late. Don't wait up. The message's subtext was clear to George. She was trying to reassure them while signaling distress. At 9:47 p.m., Schmidt paid the check and walked Stella to her car. George's jaw clenched as the man lingered by her driver's door, standing closer than professional courtesy warranted. The conversation lasted 3 minutes, 3 minutes of Stella nodding, while Schmidt spoke with animated gestures that kept bringing his hands near her shoulders. Finally, Stella got in her car and drove away. Schmidt watched her leave before retrieving his BMW from the valet, a satisfied smile playing across his features. George followed the BMW to Schmidt's apartment complex, noting the security codes, the parking arrangements, the sight lines from various positions. Old habits from a different life, but habits that might prove useful. Stella arrived home at 10:30, her professional mask still in place but cracking around the edges. "How was dinner?" Eleanor asked gently. "Informative." Stella's voice was hollow. Mr. Schmidt shared a lot of insights about corporate culture and expectations. George looked up from his laptop. "What kind of expectations?" For a moment, Stella's composure faltered. He explained that success in finance requires personal sacrifices, building relationships beyond the traditional 9-to-5 boundaries. He said he sees potential in me, but only if I'm willing to be flexible. The word flexible hung in the air like a toxin. Flexible how? Eleanor's voice had developed an edge. In my approach to professional development. He's offered to take me to industry events, introduce me to clients, help me build a network. Stella's laugh sounded brittle. He says his previous mints have done very well after learning to appreciate his guidance. George's hands stilled on the keyboard. The language was carefully chosen, plausibly deniable, but unmistakably predatory. Schmidt was offering career advancement in exchange for unstated favors, using his position of power to extract compliance. "Sweetheart," Eleanor said carefully, "how do you feel about these opportunities?" Stella's mask finally cracked. Tears spilled over as she sank onto the couch between her parents. "I hate it," she whispered. "I hate how he looks at me, how he talks to me like I'm some naive little girl who should be grateful for his attention. But I need this job. The economy's terrible, good positions are rare, and he's made it clear that my success depends on his recommendation." George wrapped his arms around his daughter, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs. Eleanor rubbed her back, making soothing sounds while shooting George a look that promised violence if he didn't fix this situation. "Has he touched you?" George asked quietly. "Not exactly. He finds excuses to stand close, adjust my collar or brush his lint off my shoulder. Says he's just helping me maintain professional standards." Stella wiped her eyes. "Tonight, he kept putting his hand on the small of my back to guide me through the restaurant. When I stiffened, he laughed and said I needed to relax, that the business world requires comfort with physical proximity." George's vision went briefly red. In his military days, he'd encountered men who used similar tactics to groom assets. The gradual boundary erosion, the manipulation of professional necessity, the isolation from support systems, it was textbook predatory behavior. "We're going to report this," Eleanor said firmly. "HR, the police, whoever." "No." Stella's response was sharp with panic. "Mom, you don't understand. He's careful. Nothing he's done is technically illegal, and his word carries weight with management. If I make accusations I can't prove, I'll be labeled a troublemaker. I'll never work in finance again." George had seen this calculation before. Predators like Schmidt deliberately operated in gray areas, using their position and reputation as shields while systematically breaking down their victims' resistance. "Then what do you want to do?" he asked gently. "I want him to leave me alone. I want to do my job without feeling like I'm constantly being evaluated as a commodity." Fresh tears spilled over. "I want to come home without feeling dirty." George held his daughter tighter, making silent promises. In the morning, he would begin the careful, methodical destruction of Craig Schmidt's comfortable little world. "Stella," he said quietly, "I need you to trust me. Can you give me a few days to look into some options?" She looked up at him with red eyes. "What kind of options?" "The kind that don't require you to prove anything to anyone." That night, after Stella had gone to bed and Eleanor was grading papers in the kitchen, George sat in his home office and opened a file he hadn't touched in 7 years. His discharge papers from Army intelligence contained contact information for colleagues who'd moved into private sector work. Men and women who understood that sometimes justice required creativity. But first, he would try a more conventional approach. George opened his laptop and began constructing a comprehensive background investigation into Craig Schmidt's career, finances, and personal life. If Schmidt was a serial predator, there would be patterns, evidence, leverage points. If conventional methods failed, George Buck knew other ways to protect his family. The man who had spent 15 years hunting human monsters in foreign countries was about to discover that domestic predators could be just as dangerous and just as vulnerable. Chapter 4. The Hunter's Preparation. George's investigation into Craig Schmidt revealed a man who had perfected the art of remaining professionally untouchable while personally reprehensible. Over the next 3 days, as Stella left each morning with increasing dread and returned each evening more emotionally battered, George assembled a profile that made his blood run cold. Schmidt's employment history showed a pattern: high performance, rapid advancement, and sudden departures preceded by unexplained settlement agreements. Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, 3 cities where promising careers had ended abruptly with sealed records and non-disclosure agreements. Meridian Financial was his 4th firm in 8 years, each move representing a lateral step that should have been a promotion for someone with his supposed track record. The devil was in the details George's insurance investigation skills helped him uncover. Hospital records from Phoenix showed a young woman named Amelia Lowe treated for anxiety and panic attacks during the exact period she'd worked under Schmidt. Her LinkedIn profile showed a brilliant career trajectory that had suddenly stalled, with no current employment listed. George found similar patterns in Dallas and Atlanta. Promising young women whose careers had either plateaued mysteriously or who had left the finance industry entirely after brief tenures at Schmidt's firms. "He's done this before," George explained to Eleanor over coffee on Saturday morning while Stella slept in. "Multiple times. He's refined his approach, learned to stay just within legal boundaries while systematically destroying his victims' confidence and careers." Eleanor set down her mug with shaking hands. "How is he still employed? NDAs, settlement money, and he's careful to choose victims who don't have powerful advocates." George's voice carried the cold fury of a father watching his child being hunted. Young women starting their careers, carrying student debt, desperate for professional success. Perfect targets for someone who understands leverage. "What are we going to do?" Before George could answer, Stella emerged from her room, moving like someone recovering from illness. She was dressed for work despite it being Saturday, her professional armor in place, but failing to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "I have to go in today," she said without meeting their gazes. "Mr. Schmidt scheduled a weekend strategy session. Just the 2 of us. He says it shows initiative." George's coffee cup cracked in his grip. "Sweetheart," Eleanor said carefully, "you don't have to." "I do." Stella's voice was flat with resignation. "He's made it clear that my review next week depends on my willingness to go above and beyond normal expectations." After she left, George and Eleanor sat in heavy silence. Their confident, ambitious daughter was being systematically broken by a predator who had spent years perfecting his technique. "I'm calling the police," Eleanor finally said. "And tell them what? That a boss is giving his employee career advice and scheduling weekend meetings?" George shook his head. "Schmidt's too careful. He's never crossed the line into anything clearly criminal." "Then what?" George's phone buzzed. A text from an old Army intelligence colleague, Keith Hayes, responding to the inquiry George had sent 2 days earlier. "Your boy Schmidt is known quantity. Phoenix PD wanted him for assault, but victim recanted after settlement. Dallas situation similar. Word is he films his mentoring sessions for insurance. Sick bastard. Want help?" George stared at the message, pieces clicking into place. Schmidt wasn't just a predator. He was a calculating one who documented his conquests, probably as blackmail material to ensure continued silence from his victims. "Eleanor," George said quietly, "I need you to go visit your sister in Colorado Springs today." She looked at him with the expression he remembered from his military deployments. "How long will you be gone?" "I'm not going anywhere, but I need to know you're safe while I handle this situation." "George, what are you planning?" He took her hands, looking directly into her eyes. "I'm planning to make sure our daughter never has to see Craig Schmidt again." That afternoon, while Eleanor drove to her sister's house and Stella endured whatever psychological torture Schmidt was inflicting during their strategy session, George prepared for war. His first stop was a storage unit he'd maintained since leaving the military. Inside, carefully preserved and perfectly legal, were tools from his former profession. Surveillance equipment, recording devices, signal interceptors, and other electronic assets that had helped him track human targets across 3 continents. His second stop was a meeting with Keith Hayes at a diner near the airport. Keith had transitioned from military intelligence to private security, specializing in corporate investigations that skirted the edges of conventional detective work. "Tell me about Schmidt," George said without preamble. Keith slid a manila folder across the table. "Craig Allen Schmidt, age 38. Born Phoenix, raised by single mother after father died in construction accident. Scholarship to Arizona State. MBA from Thunderbird. Clean record, clean credit, clean everything. Too clean. Meaning someone with his level of careful documentation doesn't do it accidentally. This guy plans 3 moves ahead." Keith opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents. Phoenix situation was ugly. 24-year-old analyst named Jennifer Loomis. Same pattern as your daughter. Isolated, pressured, gradually worn down until she was compliant. George studied the photos. A young woman who could have been Stella's sister, bright-eyed in her employee headshot, haunted and defeated in surveillance photos taken months later. What happened? Schmidt escalated too far, too fast. Got physical during a performance review at his apartment. She fought back, ended up hospitalized. Phoenix PD built a solid case, but suddenly she recanted everything, accepted a settlement, and disappeared. In Dallas, similar pattern, different outcome. Victim named Tammy Mitchell made it through the initial assault, gathered evidence, was building a case. Then someone broke into her apartment, stole her laptop and backup drives, and she received photos of herself in compromising situations she'd never posed for. George's jaw tightened. Fabricated, deep fakes probably, but convincing enough to destroy her career if released. She also took a settlement and vanished. The pieces formed a clear picture. Schmidt wasn't just a predator. He was a sophisticated one who had learned to weaponize both legal systems and technology to protect himself while destroying anyone who threatened to expose him. What about Atlanta? Keith's expression darkened. Carolina Haney, bright kid, full scholarship to Georgia Tech, landed a dream job at Schmidt's firm. 3 months later, she drove her car off a bridge. The words hit George like a physical blow. Suicide, officially ruled accidental. But her roommate said she'd been getting threatening calls, mysterious packages, had become convinced someone was watching her apartment. Keith closed the folder. Schmidt transferred to Denver 2 weeks after her funeral. George sat back, processing the full scope of what his daughter was facing. Not just a workplace predator, but a serial killer who used psychological warfare to drive his victims to destruction or compliance. "I need everything you have on his current operation," George said. "George, this guy is dangerous. Professional dangerous. You sure you want to?" "Keith." George's voice carried the tone that had once commanded rooms full of hardened intelligence operatives. "He's targeting my daughter." Keith nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Access to his apartment, his office, his electronic communications. I want to know what he's planning for Stella, and I want evidence of what he's done to the others. That's breaking and entering, wiretapping, computer intrusion. I didn't ask for a legal opinion." Keith studied his old friend's face, seeing something there that reminded him why George Buck had been one of the most effective interrogators in Army intelligence. "All right," Keith said quietly, "but we do this smart. Clean. Professional." George's phone buzzed with a text from Stella, still at office. "Going to be very late. Don't wait up." The timestamp showed 6:47 p.m. on a Saturday. No legitimate business meeting lasted this long. "Actually," George said, standing up, "we do this tonight." Chapter 5. Into the Darkness. At 11:30 p.m., George sat in his rented sedan outside Meridian Financial's downtown offices, watching the shadows play across the building's glass facade. Keith occupied the passenger's seat, surrounded by surveillance equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy thriller. Target's still inside, Keith murmured, adjusting his telephoto lens. 18th floor, corner office. Light's been on for the past 4 hours. George's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Stella's car was still in the parking garage, her last text having arrived 3 hours earlier. Working through some complex material. Learning a lot. The careful neutrality of the message made George's skin crawl. Stella only wrote in such measured tones when she was scared and trying to hide it. There, Keith pointed. Movement on 18. Through the telephoto lens, George could see into Schmidt's office. The man himself was visible as a silhouette against the interior lights, and he wasn't alone. A smaller figure sat in a chair across from his desk, a figure with Stella's posture and build. Can you get audio? Keith was already assembling a parabolic microphone. Not clear at this distance, but we can try. He aimed the device at the office windows. Getting fragments. Sounds like he's talking about career advancement. Something about trust exercises. George's phone vibrated. Another text from Stella. Mr. Schmidt is explaining industry networking protocols. Very insightful. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m. No legitimate business meeting required industry networking protocols at nearly midnight on a Saturday. I'm going up there, George said. George, wait. My daughter's been in that room for 8 hours with a man who's driven at least one woman to suicide. I'm not waiting for him to escalate. Keith grabbed his arm. Think tactically. If you storm up there now, what's your exit strategy? How do you explain your presence? What's your cover for action? George forced himself to breathe, to think like the intelligence operative he'd once been rather than the terrified father he currently was. Keith was right. Emotional responses got people killed or arrested. Options. We wait. Document everything. Build a case that can destroy him professionally and legally. Keith adjusted his recording equipment. Or we get creative. Keith pulled out a device George recognized as a signal jammer. Kill the building's cell towers for this block. Create a crisis that requires immediate evacuation. Give you cover to extract your daughter while making it impossible for Schmidt to document what happened. Before George could respond, movement in the office window caught their attention. Schmidt had moved closer to the smaller figure, his body language aggressive, dominant. The person in the chair, Stella, had shrunk back, her posture defensive. George's vision went red around the edges. Do it, he said. Keith activated the jammer, and immediately both their phones lost signal. Building security will notice the outage within minutes. Fire department probably gets an automatic alert. You've got maybe 10 minutes before this place is crawling with first responders. George was already moving, crossing the street with purposeful strides. The building's after-hour security was minimal. A single guard at the front desk who was more concerned with his smartphone than monitoring entry points. George's military training made him invisible in shadows, and his insurance investigator credentials provided plausible cover for being in a downtown office building. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his body remembering the muscle memory of tactical movement. 18 floors of concrete and steel, his breathing controlled, his mind calculating angles and sight lines and exit strategies. The 18th floor was dimly lit, most offices dark except for the corner suite where Schmidt conducted his predatory business. George moved down the hallway like a ghost, staying below window sight lines, listening for voices. Understand, Stella, that success in this industry requires complete trust between mentor and protege. Schmidt's voice carried clearly through the office door, which stood slightly ajar. The exercises I've designed are based on years of experience developing young talent. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. Stella's voice was small, frightened. Comfort is the enemy of growth. The women who've succeeded under my guidance learn to embrace discomfort, to trust my judgment, even when their limited experience made them hesitant. George eased the door open another inch, gaining visual confirmation. Schmidt stood behind Stella's chair, his hands on her shoulders, his body positioned to prevent easy escape. On his desk, a small video camera pointed at the seating area. Mr. Schmidt, please, I think I should go home now. Stella. His voice carried the tone of a parent scolding a child. Resistance to mentorship is the fastest way to derail a promising career. I've invested considerable time in your development. The least you can do is show appreciation. One of his hands moved from her shoulder toward her neck. Stella flinched away, and Schmidt's grip tightened. George stepped into the room. "Good evening." Schmidt spun around, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation before settling on professional charm. "I'm sorry, the building should be locked. Are you with security?" "I'm with Stella." George's voice was conversational, but his stance was that of a man prepared for violence. "And she's leaving now." Stella looked up with relief and shame warring across her features. "Dad, how did you?" "We'll discuss that later." George kept his eyes on Schmidt, reading the man's micro-expressions, watching for signs of escalation or flight. "Right now, we're going home." Schmidt stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "Mr. Buck, I presume? Stella's told me so much about her family. You should be proud. She's showing tremendous dedication to her career development. At midnight on a Saturday, success doesn't follow conventional schedules." Schmidt's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you understand the sacrifices required for advancement in competitive industries." George moved deeper into the room, positioning himself between Schmidt and the exit. "I understand predatory behavior when I see it." "Dad, please." Stella started to stand, but Schmidt's hand on her shoulder pressed her back down. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Buck. I hope you're not suggesting impropriety in a professional mentoring relationship." George's eyes found the video camera on the desk, its red recording light glowing steadily. "Turn that off." "I'm sorry. The camera. Turn it off. Now." Schmidt's mask slipped slightly. "I don't know what you're implying, but documentation of training sessions is standard." George crossed the room in 3 strides, snatched the camera, and dropped it to the floor. His boot crushed the device with a satisfying crack. "Stella, stand up. We're leaving." This time, when she rose, Schmidt's hand fell away, but his voice followed them as they moved toward the door. "This conversation isn't over, Mr. Buck. Stella's employment contract includes specific performance requirements. Failure to complete assigned training could result in immediate termination and legal action for breach of contract." George turned back, and something in his expression made Schmidt take an involuntary step backward. "No," George said quietly. "You're right. This conversation isn't over." As they left the building, sirens wailed in the distance, fire department responding to the communications blackout. George guided Stella to his car with a gentle hand on her back, his mind already working on the next phase of his campaign. In the car, Stella broke down completely. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I know how it looked, but he said if I didn't stay for the full training session, he'd mark my file as non-compliant. I was scared to call you. Scared he'd make it worse if I—" "Stop." George pulled over and wrapped his daughter in his arms. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. This is not your fault. But now I'll lose my job, and he'll make sure I never work anywhere else." "Stella, look at me." George waited until she met his eyes. "I promise you, Craig Schmidt will never hurt you again. Or anyone else." "How can you promise that?" George thought about the video camera he'd destroyed, about the surveillance equipment Keith was probably using to document Schmidt's activities, about the network of former military colleagues who understood that some problems required unconventional solutions. "Because," he said, starting the car, "some battles are too important to lose." Chapter 6. The Trap is Set. Sunday morning brought an illusion of normalcy that fooled no one in the Buck household. Eleanor returned from her sister's house to find Stella curled on the living room couch, wrapped in blankets like armor against the world. George sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by files and photographs that looked like the war room from his military days. "How bad?" Eleanor asked quietly, studying her husband's face. "Worse than I thought. Better than I feared." George handed her Keith's file on Schmidt's previous victims. "He's done this before multiple times, but he's also made mistakes we can exploit." Eleanor read in silence, her expression hardening with each page. When she finished, she set the folder down with shaking hands. "That poor girl in Atlanta won't be the last if Schmidt isn't stopped." George opened his laptop, showing surveillance photos Keith had taken during the night. He stayed in his office until 3 a.m. after we left, making phone calls, reviewing files. He's planning something. As if summoned by their conversation, Stella emerged from the living room, moving like someone recovering from a long illness. "I have to go to work tomorrow," she said without preamble. "If I don't show up, he'll fire me for abandonment." "Sweetheart," Eleanor started. "Mom, I know what you're thinking, but running away won't solve anything. He'll just move on to the next girl. I'll be blacklisted from every firm in Denver." Stella's voice carried a hollow determination. "At least if I'm there, I can document what he does, maybe build a case." "No." George's tone cut through her resolve. "You're not going back into that environment." "Dad, you don't understand. I understand that Schmidt is escalating. What happened last night was a test, and when you passed, when you didn't submit to his mentorship, you became a threat he needs to neutralize." George's phone buzzed with a text from Keith. "Our boy's been busy. Made 6 calls after midnight, all to lawyers and fixers. He's preparing for war." Eleanor read over George's shoulder. "Fixers, people who specialize in making problems disappear," George explained grimly. "Schmidt's not just a predator. He's a careful one with resources and connections." Stella sank into a chair, the weight of her situation finally hitting her. "So what do I do? I can't work, can't fight him, can't prove what he's done. He wins either way." George closed his laptop and looked at his daughter with the expression Eleanor recognized from his military days. The look of a man who'd made a decision that would have permanent consequences. "Stella, I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" She nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I want you to go to work tomorrow, but you won't be alone." "What do you mean?" "I mean your father is going to fix this," Eleanor said quietly, recognizing the tone in George's voice. "Aren't you?" George's phone rang before he could answer. The caller ID showed a Denver number he didn't recognize. "George Buck." "Mr. Buck, this is Craig Schmidt. I think we need to have a conversation." George activated the speakerphone. "I'm listening. Last night's misunderstanding was unfortunate. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests." Schmidt's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to negotiating from positions of power. "Stella's a talented young woman with a bright future. It would be a shame to see that future compromised by miscommunication." "What kind of accommodation?" "A mutual understanding. Stella completes her probationary period successfully, receives glowing recommendations for future positions, and we all move forward professionally. In exchange, certain recordings and documentation from last night disappear permanently." George's blood chilled. Despite destroying the camera he'd seen, Schmidt had other recording devices. He had footage of Stella in his office, probably edited to suggest consent or complicity. "And if we don't reach this accommodation, then I'm afraid Stella's employment will be terminated for cause. Harassment of supervisors, inappropriate workplace behavior, violation of confidentiality agreements." With documentation to support these charges, her prospects in finance would be limited. The threat was clear: submit to continued predation or face career destruction backed by fabricated evidence. "I need time to consider your offer," George said. "Of course. But Mr. Buck, time is a limited commodity. I suggest we resolve this quickly, before misunderstandings compound into something more serious." The line went dead. Stella looked up at her parents with despair. "He recorded everything, didn't he? Even after you destroyed that camera?" "Probably." George was already texting Keith, requesting immediate electronic surveillance of Schmidt's communications. But recordings can be edited, manipulated, discredited. They're only as valuable as people's willingness to believe them. "Dad, what are you planning?" George stood up, his decision crystallizing into action. "I'm planning to give Craig Schmidt exactly what he deserves." That afternoon, while Eleanor took Stella shopping for what she euphemistically called security equipment, recording devices, pepper spray, and a GPS tracker disguised as jewelry, George met with Keith at the storage facility. "Schmidt made contact," George reported. "He's got blackmail material on Stella. Wants to force continued compliance with his mentorship." Keith nodded grimly. "Classic playbook. But there's something else you need to know." He handed George a flash drive. I've been monitoring his communications since last night. He's not just planning to blackmail your daughter. He's planning to eliminate the threat she represents. George plugged the drive into a laptop, revealing recorded phone conversations, text messages, and email chains that painted a chilling picture. Schmidt had contacted associates in Phoenix and Dallas, discussing permanent solutions to recurring problems. He'd researched Eleanor's work schedule, Stella's apartment security, and George's background. Most disturbing, he'd begun reaching out to criminal contacts about services that went far beyond character assassination. He's going to have her killed, George said flatly. Looks that way. Probably make it look like suicide, same as Atlanta. He's got the psychological profile to support it. Traumatized young woman, mounting pressure, family conflicts. George stared at the evidence, feeling something cold and familiar settling in his chest. During his military service, he'd hunted men who threatened American assets overseas. The methodology was always the same. Identify the threat, gather intelligence, plan the operation, execute with extreme prejudice. Craig Schmidt had graduated from workplace predator to credible threat against George's family. Keith, I need you to do something for me. Name it. I need you to disappear for the next 48 hours. Go visit family, take a vacation, establish an alibi far from Denver. Keith studied his friend's face. George, whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking that some problems require permanent solutions. And I'm thinking you don't need to be anywhere near this operation when it happens. If you're planning what I think you're planning, you're going to need backup, support, extraction. George was already walking away, his mind shifting into the tactical framework that had served him in darker places against more dangerous men. No, he said without looking back. This one I do alone. That night, George sat in his home office until 3 a.m., planning the most important mission of his life. By dawn, Craig Schmidt's world would begin to unravel in ways the predator couldn't predict, control, or survive. Some battles, George reflected, were worth risking everything to win. Chapter 7, The Long Night. Monday night descended on Denver with unseasonable cold, as if the city itself sensed that something fundamental was about to shift in the natural order. George sat in his rented sedan outside Schmidt's apartment complex, surrounded by equipment that hadn't seen use since his military service. Night vision scopes, recording devices, communication jammers, and other tools from a profession most people preferred to forget existed. Stella's first day back at work had gone exactly as predicted. Schmidt had been charming and professional in front of colleagues, subtly threatening when they were alone. He'd scheduled another training session for tomorrow evening, making it clear that her attendance was mandatory for successful completion of her probationary period. But Schmidt wouldn't make it to tomorrow's meeting. At 11:47 p.m., George's target emerged from the apartment elevator, dressed in expensive workout clothes despite the late hour. Schmidt's gym routine was another piece of intelligence Keith's surveillance had provided. The predator was vain about his physical appearance, working out when the gym was nearly empty to maintain his image of controlled perfection. George followed at a distance as Schmidt drove to the upscale fitness center, noting security cameras, exit routes, and sight lines. The gym was nearly deserted at this hour, perfect for a conversation that required privacy. Schmidt was 40 minutes into his workout routine when the facility's lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the gym in dim red illumination that created more shadows than visibility. George had disabled the main power feed from outside the building, using techniques learned during sabotage operations in places the Pentagon preferred not to discuss. "Hello," Schmidt called out, his voice echoing in the empty facility. "Is anyone there?" "Good evening, Craig." George stepped out of the shadows near the weight racks, his appearance transformed by tactical clothing and equipment that made him look like something from Schmidt's worst nightmares. Night vision goggles hung around his neck, and his movement suggested military training that civilian minds couldn't categorize. "Who?" Schmidt stumbled backward, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "The gym is closed. You're trespassing. So are you." George's voice was calm, conversational, but carried undertones that made Schmidt's fight-or-flight response spike toward panic. This facility closed to the public at 9 p.m. You have after-hours access because you've been bribing the night manager to ignore certain activities that occur in the private training rooms. Schmidt's face went pale in the emergency lighting. I don't know what you're talking about. George activated a handheld device, and Schmidt's voice filled the empty gym. Jennifer was reluctant at first, but private sessions helped her understand industry expectations. The recordings from those sessions proved educational for both of us. The recording was from a phone conversation with an associate in Phoenix, discussing Schmidt's previous victim. George had dozens of similar recordings, all documenting Schmidt's pattern of predation, blackmail, and witness intimidation. You've been a busy man, Craig. Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, Denver. Always the same methodology. Identify vulnerable targets, isolate them, document their submission, then use that documentation to ensure silence. George moved closer, his footsteps echoing off the gym equipment. Tell me about Carolina Haney. Schmidt's composure shattered completely. She was unstable. The investigation cleared me of any. The investigation was closed after you paid off the right people and threatened her family. But I've spoken to her roommate, her therapist, her parents. They know what you did. You can't prove anything. Everything I've done has been legal, professional. George activated another device, projecting images onto the gym's wall-mounted television screens. Security footage from Meridian Financial showing Schmidt cornering female employees, touching them inappropriately, creating situations designed to compromise and control. Your office security system backs up everything to cloud storage. Interesting how many mentoring sessions you've conducted after hours, alone with young women who clearly didn't want to be there. Schmidt was backing toward the emergency exit, but George had positioned himself to control all egress routes. What do you want? The predator's voice had lost all pretense of authority, revealing the pathetic core beneath his polished facade. I want you to understand something, Craig. You've spent years believing you were untouchable because you were careful, because you chose victims who couldn't fight back, because you had money and connections and legal protection. George's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. But you made one critical error. What error? You targeted my daughter. George activated every piece of equipment he'd brought, filling the gym with recorded conversations, financial documents showing payoffs to victims, medical records from women Schmidt had driven to nervous breakdowns, and communications with fixers discussing permanent solutions to troublesome witnesses. This is everything, Craig. Your entire operation, documented and distributed to law enforcement agencies in 4 states, the FBI, and major news outlets. Your career is over. Your freedom is over. Your ability to hurt anyone else is over. Schmidt looked around at the evidence of his crimes playing on multiple screens, his world collapsing in real time. But I'm offering you one opportunity to minimize the damage, George continued. A chance to end this with some shred of dignity intact. What do you mean? George handed him a piece of paper. Your resignation letter. Effective immediately, citing personal reasons. You disappear from Denver, from the finance industry, from anywhere young women might encounter you. In exchange, I don't release the footage I have of you in compromising situations with underage interns from your Phoenix job. Schmidt's eyes widened. That's impossible. I never. Deepfake technology is remarkable these days. Almost impossible to distinguish from reality, especially when combined with authentic audio recordings of your voice discussing inappropriate relationships. George's smile held no warmth. Of course, proving the videos are fabricated would require extensive legal proceedings, media attention, forensic analysis. Your reputation would be destroyed long before the truth emerged. The predator stared at the resignation letter, realizing he was trapped by his own methodology. For years, he'd used fabricated or manipulated evidence to control his victims. Now that weapon was turned against him. If I sign this, how do I know you won't release everything anyway? Because unlike you, Craig, I keep my word. Sign the letter, disappear from Denver, never contact my daughter or any other young woman in a professional context again, and you get to slink away into obscurity instead of facing federal charges for interstate stalking, blackmail, and conspiracy. Schmidt's hands shook as he signed the resignation letter. "There's one more thing," George said as the predator finished writing. "You're going to call in sick tomorrow, then deliver this resignation to your supervisor by email. You'll pack your personal belongings during lunch when the office is mostly empty, and you'll be gone by the end of the week. And if I don't?" George's expression went completely cold. "Then I release everything, and you discover what happens when a decorated military intelligence officer decides someone represents a threat to his family." The lights came back on, flooding the gym with normal illumination that somehow made the threat more real rather than less. George looked like an ordinary middle-aged man again, but Schmidt would never forget the glimpse he'd gotten of the predator's predator. "One last piece of advice, Craig. There are men like me all over this country. Fathers, brothers, husbands who've learned skills in service to their nation that they'll use without hesitation to protect their families. You've been hunting sheep, but you just discovered you're surrounded by wolves." George walked away, leaving Schmidt alone in the gym with the wreckage of his carefully constructed life playing on screens around him. The drive home took 20 minutes. George spent it thinking about justice, about protection, about the thin line between civilization and the measures sometimes required to preserve it. When he pulled into his driveway, Eleanor was waiting in the kitchen window, and Stella was asleep on the living room couch, finally peaceful for the first time in weeks. George Buck had kept his promise. Craig Schmidt would never hurt his daughter again, or anyone else's. Chapter 8, Unraveling. Tuesday morning brought a sense of anticipation that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. Stella dressed for work with more confidence than she'd shown in weeks, though she couldn't articulate why she felt safer. George sat at the breakfast table, outwardly calm, while monitoring news feeds and law enforcement communications for any sign that Schmidt had deviated from their agreement. At 8:23 a.m., Schmidt called in sick to Meridian Financial. George's intercept of company communications confirmed the call was made from Schmidt's apartment in a voice that sounded genuinely ill, which wasn't surprising given the psychological trauma of having one's entire predatory operation exposed and neutralized in a single night. Eleanor poured coffee with steady hands, but George caught the micro-tremors that indicated she knew something significant had transpired. After 25 years of marriage, she could read his moods better than satellite intelligence could read enemy positions. "How was your evening?" she asked carefully. "Productive. I think Stella's work environment is about to improve dramatically." At 9:47 a.m., Schmidt's resignation email arrived in the inbox of Meridian Financial's Human Resources Director. George's surveillance of company communications showed the message triggered immediate confusion and scrambling among upper management. Schmidt was a high performer with significant client relationships. His abrupt departure would create operational chaos. By 10:15 a.m., the company president was calling Schmidt's phone repeatedly, getting voicemail each time. By noon, building security reported that Schmidt had entered the premises during lunch hour, cleaned out his office in under 30 minutes, and departed without speaking to anyone. George's phone buzzed with a text from Keith. "Target's BMW just crossed state line heading east. Looks like your conversation was persuasive." Stella called at 2:17 p.m., her voice bright with confused relief. "Dad, the strangest thing happened. Mr. Schmidt resigned this morning, and they're saying he took a position out of state. My new supervisor is a woman named Nancy McKenna, and she's normal, professional. She actually wanted to discuss my work performance based on my actual work." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. It's just so sudden." Yesterday, he was scheduling evening sessions and talking about long-term mentorship, and today he's gone. "Do you think our conversation Saturday night scared him off?" George thought about Schmidt's face in the gym emergency lighting, about the predator's complete psychological collapse when confronted with evidence of his crimes and the promise of consequences he couldn't manipulate or escape. "I think," George said carefully, "that some people eventually realize they've pushed things too far." That afternoon brought validation of George's strategy from an unexpected source. Eleanor answered a phone call from a number she didn't recognize, then handed the phone to George with an expression of bewilderment. "George Buck." "Mr. Buck, this is Jennifer Loomis. I think you know who I am." George recognized the name immediately. Schmidt's first documented victim in Phoenix. Ms. Loomis. How did you get this number? From Keith Hayes. He said you might want to hear what I have to say. Her voice carried the carefully controlled tone of someone who'd spent years in therapy learning to speak about trauma. Craig Schmidt destroyed my life 3 years ago. I've been waiting ever since for someone to make him pay. I see. Keith told me Schmidt resigned his position yesterday, fled Denver with no forwarding address, and that certain evidence of his activities has been preserved for law enforcement review. Her voice strengthened. Mr. Buck, I don't know what you did, but I want you to know that 3 other women have contacted me today. Women from Dallas, Atlanta, women who've been living in fear and shame because of what Schmidt did to them. George said nothing, letting her continue. We're filing a joint civil suit against Schmidt personally and his former employers who enabled his behavior. Keith provided us with documentation that will make the case impossible to dismiss or settle quietly. For the first time in 3 years, I believe that bastard is finally going to face consequences. After she hung up, George sat in his office thinking about the ripple effects of direct action. Schmidt's removal from Denver was only the beginning. His victims were organizing, finding their voices, preparing to seek justice through conventional legal channels now that the predator could no longer retaliate. Eleanor appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression she wore during important conversations. Was he dangerous? She asked without preamble. Yes, dangerous enough to justify unconventional methods. George considered his answer carefully. Dangerous enough that conventional methods would have failed and more people would have been hurt. She nodded, accepting the explanation without demanding details she probably didn't want to know. Is it over? For us? Yes. For him. George shrugged. I suspect Craig Schmidt's problems are just beginning. As if summoned by their conversation, George's secure phone, the one he'd maintained for communications that couldn't be intercepted, buzzed with a message from Keith. Phoenix PD reopening Schmidt investigation based on new evidence. Dallas following suit. FBI interested in interstate pattern. Our boy stepped in it big time. Wednesday brought news that Schmidt's carefully constructed life was unraveling with a thoroughness that only justice long delayed could achieve. His former employers were distancing themselves, his financial accounts were being frozen pending investigation, and his reputation in the finance industry was disintegrating as victims found the courage to speak publicly. Thursday afternoon, Stella came home from work with an energy George hadn't seen since her college graduation. Nancy McKenna is amazing, she reported over dinner. She's actually interested in developing my analytical skills instead of other things. And the work environment is so different with Schmidt gone. People seem relaxed, more collaborative. Any word on why he left so suddenly? Eleanor asked. Just rumors. Some people think he was offered a better position elsewhere. Others suspect he was involved in something inappropriate. Stella's expression darkened slightly. A few of the women in the office mentioned he made them uncomfortable, but they thought that was just his management style. George and Eleanor exchanged glances. Schmidt's predation had been an open secret, tolerated because no one wanted to confront someone with his perceived power and connections. The important thing, George said, is that you're safe and able to focus on building your career. Friday brought the final confirmation that George's mission had been completely successful. Keith forwarded a news article from Phoenix paper. Former investment executive arrested on multiple charges. Craig Schmidt had been taken into custody while attempting to board a flight to a non-extradition country. The joint investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies had uncovered evidence of interstate stalking, blackmail, tax evasion, and conspiracy. His victims were cooperating fully, and additional charges were expected. George deleted the message and smiled. Justice, he reflected, sometimes required patience. But when it finally arrived, it was thorough. Chapter 9, Justice Served. 3 months later, George Buck sat in his home office reading the final chapter of Craig Schmidt's story. The Denver Post business section carried a small item about the former Meridian financial supervisor's sentencing. 12 years in federal prison for interstate stalking, blackmail, and conspiracy, with additional state charges pending in 3 jurisdictions. The article mentioned that Schmidt's victims had formed a support group that was working with law enforcement agencies to identify and prosecute workplace predators across the finance industry. Their advocacy had led to policy changes at major firms and new training protocols designed to prevent the systematic abuse of junior employees. George closed the newspaper and looked out his window at Stella's car pulling into the driveway. His daughter bounded up the front steps with an energy that reminded him of her teenage years, when the world held unlimited possibilities and she believed she could achieve anything. "Dad, guess what?" She burst through the front door, waving a piece of paper with official letterhead. "I got promoted. Senior analyst, with a 20% raise and my own office." Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, beaming at their daughter's excitement. Nancy McKenna said, "I'm the youngest person in company history to advance to senior level so quickly," Stella continued. "She wanted to lead the new client acquisition team." George hugged his daughter, marveling at how completely she'd recovered from Schmidt's psychological warfare. The confidence in her voice, the happiness in her eyes, the sense of unlimited potential, all of it had returned once the predator was removed from her environment. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You've worked hard for this. The best part is the work environment now. Nancy's hired 3 more women for senior positions, and the whole culture is changing. People actually collaborate instead of competing through intimidation." Stella's expression grew thoughtful. It's funny how much one person can poison an entire workplace, and how quickly things improve when that toxicity is removed. That evening, as they celebrated Stella's promotion with dinner at her favorite restaurant, George's phone buzzed with a text from Keith. "Saw the news about our friend's sentencing. Justice served. Beer soon." George typed back, "Absolutely. This one's on me." At the restaurant, Stella raised her wine glass for a toast. To new beginnings, and to parents who always believe in their children. George clinked his glass against his daughter's, thinking about the path that had led them to this moment. 3 months ago, Stella had been a victim trapped in an impossible situation, slowly being destroyed by a predator who believed himself untouchable. Now she was a successful young professional with unlimited potential, working in an environment that valued her intelligence and integrity. "Dad," Stella said as they walked to their cars after dinner, "I never properly thanked you for that night at the office building, when you showed up and got me out of there. You don't need to thank me for protecting my daughter, but I do need to ask you something." She looked at him with the direct gaze she'd inherited from his side of the family. "Did you have anything to do with Schmidt leaving so suddenly?" George considered his answer carefully. "I may have had a conversation with him about the importance of treating employees with respect." Stella studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that reminded her of the quiet confidence he'd carried throughout her childhood. The sense that her father was someone who could handle any problem, solve any crisis, protect his family from any threat. "Well," she said finally, "whatever you said to him, it worked." He disappeared like he'd seen a ghost. George smiled, remembering Schmidt's face in the gym's emergency lighting, the predator's complete psychological collapse when confronted with evidence of his crimes and the promise of consequences he couldn't escape. "Some people," he said, "just need the right motivation to make better life choices." They hugged goodbye in the restaurant parking lot, and George watched his daughter drive away with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The predator who had threatened his family was neutralized, his victims had found justice, and the workplace culture that had enabled his behavior was being transformed. A few days later, Keith arrived at George's house with a cooler of beer and war stories from their shared past. They sat on the back patio, 2 former soldiers enjoying a peaceful evening in suburban Denver. "Read Schmidt's victim impact statements," Keith said, opening his second beer. "Powerful stuff. Those women found their voices once he couldn't retaliate anymore. Good for them." Phoenix prosecutor said Schmidt broke down completely when they showed him the evidence you'd compiled. Confessed to everything, implicated associates in 3 states. Apparently, he keeps asking how someone found out about his operations. George smiled. "Let him wonder. You know what I think?" Keith leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I think Craig Schmidt spent so many years believing he was the apex predator that he forgot predators have natural enemies, such as fathers, brothers, husbands, men who've learned skills in service to their country and will use those skills without hesitation to protect their families. They sat in comfortable silence. Two men who understood that sometimes justice required more than legal proceedings and conventional remedies.